Kia ora koutou, good evening. Thank you very much for joining us tonight for Reimagining Aotearoa, which is one of a continuing series of town halls that we're holding online. We're going to be starting in a few minutes, and we've got three really fabulous panelists to introduce to you. But we're just going to take a few more minutes to let people join us on screen.
And kia ora whānau. It's wonderful to see everyone again here in our town halls. While we are letting people keep joining us, just a few housekeeping points before we get underway with a whakatauki and a quick mihi. You may have noticed a pop-up poll just before on your screen. Feel free to fill this out so that we can see whereabouts in the country people are tuning in from. There will be some time for questions also at the end, and you can put your question in the chat, which you can access with the button along the bottom of your screen. Your messages will be sent through to myself and James and our panelists, and we'll be directing those questions. We're also live streaming this event to YouTube, so we'll post that link in the chat so that you can invite any of your whānau and friends. As many people as want to can actually join us on that live stream link as well. Is there anything I might have missed, James?
No, I don't think so. That's pretty comprehensive. And we've got coming up on nearly 300 people here. And also we do have people over on YouTube as well, as you mentioned. So it's probably about time that we get rolling. Would you like to start us off with a whakatauki?
Kia ora, James. I wanted to take the opportunity to share this whakatauki. Mā te oranga o te taiao, ka ora ai te iwi, mō te takitini, kaore mō te tarutaru anake, mō te torutoru anake. And that means it is the well-being of our environment or our climate that will sustain us for the many and not just for the few. I thought that was quite a fitting whakatauki for us to share tonight. So I believe we're back to you, James.
Kia ora, Marama. Thank you for that. So what we're doing is we're just gathering in some of the feedback from the poll, and we'll be showing you some of those results shortly. We've got golly, good 66% of our people are from overseas, it seems, which is interesting. So welcome if you are joining us from overseas, or I suspect that some of you have probably got your profile set up as an international. Great to see some people from Southland. Welcome Southland. A few people from Otago. One from the West Coast. Hello. Canterbury and Christchurch. Good showing from there. And in the North Island, heaps of Wellingtonians. Go Wellington. Thank you for for joining us, and good showing from Manawatu as well. So wonderful to have you all, and hello to all of you Aucklanders who are joining us. So great spread from around the country, and if this is correct, from around the world. So 26 of you who have filled out the form, 63% have said that this is your first Green Party virtual town hall. So welcome if you haven't made it along to one of these before. This is, I think, the 4th or 5th in a series, and it certainly won't be the last. So welcome, and thank you also to those of you who are returning, having been with us for some of our previous our previous town halls. And what people are looking forward to most at Alert Level 2, most people are saying having friends over and seeing whānau. And I think that's fabulous, because what that speaks to is that, for everything else and all the other things that we value, and we kind of want to get back to having fun, getting a haircut, doing some outdoor recreation, so on and so forth, actually the thing that we've been missing the most is human contact with those who are close to us. So I know that for me personally, that is the thing that I have missed the most about the state of emergency and working from home over the last few weeks. So I completely empathize with where you're coming from there. So thank you very much for participating in that. Now, obviously, climate change is something I spend a lot of my time thinking about and working on. And we've got three fabulous panelists to look at different aspects of climate action and the post-COVID pandemic crisis recovery and how those things come together. And we'll be introducing some of those in a moment. We thought this was important because when there is a crisis like this, it's an entirely understandable human reaction that people say, look, I just want things to go back to the way they were before. Can we just go back to normal, please? We know a lot of people are worried about their jobs, they're worried about their incomes, they're worried about their homes and being able to make sure that their family are able to stay in safe, warm and dry accommodation and so on. And we also know, of course, that, whilst things have been tough recently, actually, when it comes to the economic effects of the pandemic, it's the next few months that we're going to see a lot of things. So we can completely understand that instinct. And yet, when we look back at history, some of it quite recent history, when there's been some kind of economic shock, obviously nothing on the scale of what it is today, generally when governments do stimulus packages to try and resuscitate things, they do tend to invest in the status quo. And actually, when it comes to climate change, we cannot afford to do that one more time. We know from the scientists who inform the UN that it is actually the next 10 years that counts the most in terms of bringing down our carbon dioxide emissions, that they have to at least halve over the course of the next 10 years if we're to have any hope of staying within the 1.5 degree limit. What that means is, because we are about to spend a gargantuan amount of money re-stimulating the economy, getting jobs to people, for those who have lost them, trying to, build industries for the future to make sure that once we get past the crisis, there are still jobs for people to work in, supporting people on low incomes or with health effects through the worst of the crisis. It is a colossal effort. And actually what that means is that future generations are going to be helping us to get through it, because they'll be paying off the debt that we're running up in order to pay for the crisis. And what that means is that we're essentially spending money not just on behalf of today's generations, but on those of our children and our grandchildren as well. And the climate crisis isn't going away. So if we don't direct the stimulus package at climate action, then we're actually depriving those children and grandchildren of the ability to pay for it themselves and to take care of it themselves. So I think that we have both a moral and an economic duty to ensure that this is, in fact, a green recovery. And in fact, there's also a real opportunity, because under a business as usual scenario, generally governments don't have permission to do really big things. Our responses are fairly incremental and change is slow and it's really hard, and it has to get balanced out against all of the other priorities that a government has. So we also know that because climate change is, and decarbonizing our economy and adapting to the effects of climate change is such a big effort, it actually requires an investment and a response at the scale of the challenge. And that is actually what we have on our hands right now in the form of the post-COVID recovery. So that's the kind of theme for tonight. But we've got three people who really look at this from different angles, and they range from how we run our agricultural systems and the food that we eat and buy and where does it come from, right through to how we design our towns and our cities, through to climate justice, and in particular, the role of our Pacific Island neighbours and families and whānau. So, Marama, take us away.
Kia ora, James. I'm inspired by what James has just wrapped up for us about the choices and the decisions that government has a chance to make right now in Aotearoa. And I simply wanted to start off, this is a Bernie Sanders quote, but it's something that First Nations and Indigenous people have been saying for quite some time that I thought was also relevant. And he says, addressing the climate crisis does not only mean that shifting to renewable energy, it means working to undo the harms of environmental racism and ensuring justice for communities of colour, Native Americans, people with disabilities, children and seniors. And obviously that's an American political context. Here in Aotearoa, what many of our frontline and grassroots activists have been talking about for a long time is the connection of our climate crisis to our social justice and environmental crisis, and the work that we have to do to bring communities together and ensure that people are no longer being left out in the cold, that we are building and designing inclusive communities that value everyone's worth and contribution to our communities. And until we are able to do that, we can't all get on board the work towards reducing and redesigning an economy and communities that reduce our emissions together in a way that does not continue to make it hardest for those already struggling, for those with the least resource and power and support. So that's really all I wanted to start my thoughts off with tonight. I'm pretty excited about our panelists who I know will pick up more on some of those themes there. Thank you, James.
Madam, I couldn't agree more. I mean, certainly one of the things I think we've observed during the pandemic crisis is that it has revealed in even starker relief some of the existing inequalities in our society and in our economy. And of course, if that happens during a pandemic crisis, it's also certainly going to be amplified during the climate crisis. And I know it's pretty easy in the climate change space to get stuck on things like solar panels and wind turbines and, you know, regenerative agriculture and cycle lanes and things like that. Quite a technical thing, and all of that is important and has its place. But actually, we often forget that it is only by being able to bring all of us along and include everyone that we're actually going to be able to solve this problem and solve it together. Marama, would you like to introduce our first guest?
I'm really excited. I would love to. So as we bring each of our guests in, we're asking our guests to tell us what hat, what portai, or what role you are wearing tonight, and I understand many of you wear more than one, what organisations you're affiliated with, and one thing that is top of mind for you in terms of climate action after COVID-19. Just a little bit more housekeeping before that, a reminder that we are live streaming this on YouTube. So kia ora to anyone tuning in from YouTube. And remember to send us your questions via the chat function in Zoom and on YouTube. You can do it on either. And we are just about to hear from the three incredible guests that we have lined up tonight. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Mary Moiono-Kolio from the Pacific Climate Warriors. And Mary has turned your camera on. Kia ora. Thank you, Mary. It's pretty special to have you along tonight. Ngā mihi ki a koe. Thank you so much for joining us. So go ahead, Mary.
Well, firstly, tēnā kōrua and talofa lava. Thank you so much for having us and having the warriors represented here. It's a conversation that's really important to us, and so we're really grateful for the space that you've created. I'm part of an organization called the Pacific Climate Warriors, and so we're a network of Pacific activists, Pacific youth activists across 15 islands, and we have 6 teams in the diaspora. And so we're young people that have come together to fight for our islands, regardless of the fact that our people are the smallest contributors to the crisis. So I'm also really excited to hear that there's 66% from overseas, because I think that's my family. So that's awesome. But I guess one thing that's been on top of mind for me in regards to climate change and COVID has been how COVID-19 has really highlighted the social inequities within our communities and within our societies, like was mentioned. And what struck me is how the people of Aotearoa have really mobilized and organized themselves to wrap support around those in our communities who are the most at risk and the most vulnerable to the impacts of COVID. So that's really exemplified to me the community building and resilience, and that so many things that were previously put in the too hard basket, now COVID has shone a light on these huge gaps within our society that we're forced to be ambitious and bold in our response. And so, you know, we've seen it with personally, I think the government's done a great job in terms of, you know, putting our vulnerable homeless communities in homes, you know, simple things like removing data caps and getting devices out to, you know, young people and families. It's been amazing to see that. And so that's been really heartwarming for me, but it's also, while it's been heartwarming, it's also been complex in the sense that when I think of the communities that I represent and our experiences of COVID-19 and climate change, you know, our islands have just experienced a tropical cyclone Harold. It was a Category 5. And so obviously climate change already exacerbates these social inequalities. And now that's compounded by a global pandemic. So I guess like just understanding the magnitude of that injustice, I think is really important to kind of center our thinking when we're talking about climate justice, that there are communities that already face huge social inequalities, but now it's being compounded by two crises. And I guess in addition to that, you know, there's this conversation around how almost COVID-19 has been this blessing in disguise, and that the environment's been able to breathe. And I think what people often fail to comprehend is that those cleaner airways and cleaner canals and cleaner rivers come at the cost of those in our communities and our society who are most vulnerable. And that's like climate change as well. And so while we're all hopeful that we are going to solve this, my fear as a young Pacific person is that it will be at the cost of my islands. And so that's why we do the work that we do. And so a lot of my reflection has been on, okay, how do we take principles of just recovery forward, and ensuring that people recognize that our response to climate action and COVID needs to understand that the health of our environment is the health of our people and therefore our economy. So a lot of reflections.
Well, kia ora, Mary. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's a really important kōrero that you've given us, because it is something I think it's pretty easy for you know, New Zealanders to forget when we're all running around, you know, trying to get by and you know, doing our jobs and focusing on our lane, is actually that we're part of a not just one community here in Aotearoa, but many communities here in Aotearoa, and actually that our community extends well beyond Aotearoa and it connects out into the Pacific and beyond as well. So thank you for that. Mary, I'm just going to ask you to stay on the line. Keep connected, please, if you don't mind. And we're going to bring on our next guest, who is an old friend, Amanda Larson from Greenpeace. I first met Amanda when she was working for the Green Party, actually, a few years ago. She was doing the job of heading up our climate campaign. And she's been working for Greenpeace for a number of years now and leading the climate campaign there. So Amanda, lovely to see you again. Thank you for joining us and welcome.
Tēnā koutou, thanks so much for having me here on this panel today. I'm so excited about all the different panel events and town halls that have been happening over the last few weeks, reimagining a different future, and just the volume of people who've been attending them. I think that's a really hopeful sign. So I'm excited to be part of this one. What's top of mind for me? I think the main thing is that COVID has shown that both people and governments can adapt quickly in the times of crisis. And like Mary said, you know, we've stopped what we're doing to work collectively to look after the most vulnerable people in our society. And it's one of those things that didn't seem possible before COVID, to kind of put the brakes on this runaway train of business as usual, and, you know, to keep using that silly rail metaphor to sort of build new tracks and change course. But yeah, I think it's opened up a possibility to sort of leap towards a better future that we haven't really seen in our generation. You know, maybe post-war was the last time something like this came around. So I feel pretty excited about that opportunity, but I'm also sort of daunted about what happens if we don't get it right. So yeah, I'm a total energy nerd. That's kind of my background. So what I'm excited about is the potential to completely redesign how our energy system works in New Zealand. And I think there's some really obvious stuff. You know, there's 600,000 households that are under insulated in New Zealand, and we need to fix that straight away, especially since we're going into winter with a virus lingering. But there's also so much potential to kit out people's homes with solar, with batteries, to provide finance for iwi-owned and community-owned and household-owned clean energy, so that people are managing their own energy instead of being reliant on power companies, and also creating heaps of local jobs in every town and city and community. So that's exciting for me, but I'm here representing a whole organization. And one thing we did today was released a regenerative agriculture vision. Our hope is that the government will invest, well, at least $1 billion in a transformation of our agricultural sector, which the Prime Minister has said New Zealand should be the leading agricultural nation in terms of sustainable production, and that's a vision that we hope to see kind of realized through a series of policies to support farmers to shift to regenerative production. So I'm pretty excited about the opportunities. Like I said, a little bit daunted about missing the opportunities. So yeah, I'm glad to see how many people are on this call and being part of this korero about how we can build back better and not build back business as usual. So thanks again for inviting me.
Kia ora, Amanda. No, thank you for your time and coming to share some incredible solutions. I couldn't agree more, especially where we just take housing and how we build homes alone, and how much they can be part of our way of not just reducing our emissions, but ensuring our people are healthier and less of our people, our elderly and our children, get sick every year from living in cold houses. And if we make sure homes are warm and healthy, we are able to look after people and our climate. And there are so many more examples of exactly where we can be pushing those levers. So ngā mihi, Amanda, for your incredible expertise as well. I'll ask you two, of course, to stay there, and we can bring on our third guest tonight, who is Gary Marshall from Resilio Studio. Hara mai, Gary, I hope I said that correctly. So your turn, yep, there you go. And Gary, it's really great to have you with us tonight. I'd like to ask you, what have you and Resilio Studio been thinking about in terms of climate action lately?
Kia ora, Manuel. Yeah, so I've got a background in landscape architecture, permaculture, town planning, urban design. So one of the things that's really kind of, I guess, surprised me is the rate which people have taken up kind of walking and cycling, partly through need. But, you know, cycling increased by 60% of all trips in Auckland during level 4 lockdown were by cycle. So that's really encouraging to see. I'm a little bit skeptical that, you know, New Zealand's car culture will see us flocking back to cars, but I have been doing a little bit of reading around that. You know, it's quite heartening to see studies out of Sweden and Japan that kind of demonstrate through times of change, people start to form habits which stick once this kind of change goes. So I'm hopeful that that's going to stick around for a little while, and that people will start shifting to walking and cycling and using some of the nearby local parks a little bit more than maybe the parks hundreds of kilometers away that they only require walking to rather than driving to. One of the other things that probably I find kind of exciting is this idea that the Overton window, you guys will be familiar with that idea that the window of politically correct conversation has kind of opened a little bit. And we're seeing conversations that are, 6 months ago or even 2 months ago, you wouldn't have heard politicians talking around prioritizing local production and trade over international globalization. And so it's, I guess, is from a resilience and a sustainability perspective, it's really heartening. And there's like an opportunity today and for the next kind of little while to take advantage of, these times when people are more willing and open to new and different ideas and ways of thinking that aren't always there when business as usual is running its course.
Over to you, James.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. Look, that is certainly something that's been weighing on our minds as well. And when you were talking about people getting into the habit of cycling and so on, and I was watching a video online from Albania where they're rolling out emergency cycle lanes to cope with the fact that there are now so many people who are choosing to cycle through Tirana. And actually, it's something that our colleague Julian Gent has put some money up for here as well for councils who want to do that. So it would be very interesting, and I do hope that you're right, and that a lot of that stuff sticks. Now, in a moment, we're going to be directing questions at you from the 352 people who have joined us on the Zoom call, and I think that we've got something like just over 100 people watching on YouTube. So tēnā koe, welcome to those of you who are on the YouTube channel. But first, I've got a question for each of you, and Mary, I'll start with you if you don't mind. The question is, what are the opportunities that you see for improving social equity whilst we're responding to climate change?
Yeah, I think building on what I was sharing around how our communities have really mobilized and seeing that we have a responsibility to look after each other. And it seems really simplistic, but I think those are simple lessons that we need to really take forward in our response post-COVID, and recognizing that we need to be sharing resources. We need to acknowledge that there are people in our communities that have more than others. And it seems very simple, but understanding that at that very basic level, there are those people in our communities who need secure jobs, need a livable income. Those kind of things are the things I think we should be centering. So I think there's opportunity there to start really reframing the climate conversation around climate justice. And I think that doesn't happen as often as people think that happens. Climate justice is often an added, in my experience. It's not always a center. It's not always centered in our conversations and our responses. And I think that's really important.
Thank you, Mary. Amanda, can we turn to you now, please?
I'm afraid I'm a policy nerd, so this is going to be a bit policy heavy. But yeah, like I said before, clean energy, I just think there's so many opportunities. Insulation, solar, wind power, all things that can be owned by individual people instead of power companies, or owned by communities, papakainga housing, marae. So there's so many options there. And all of these are programs that would, have local benefits, but also have health benefits. We need a massive clean energy training center to be able to train up the thousands of people who are going to actually do this work. And there's a real opportunity in this post-COVID space to provide good training and employment for people. At the risk of stealing Gary's thunder, I think public and active transport is such a massive opportunity. Making space on our streets for people to walk, to cycle, to use wheelchairs, to invest in accessible busways and rail lines. We know from evidence that this creates heaps more jobs than investing in roads. It gives people options to move actively, which improves their health. there's heaps of options there. And I guess the one thing that I want to put out there is a bit of a challenge to anyone from government who might see this one day, is that we need to ensure that our bailouts are equitable, and that the public money that we are spending now, borrowing from future generations of taxpayers, is not going towards bailing out businesses who operate in tax havens, and is coming with strings attached for corporations that are, not treating their workers well, or who are emissions heavy, and making sure that those strings are applied to any bailouts that ensure that they come out more centered on providing good working conditions and reducing emissions to ensure that our young people actually have a future on this planet. So yeah, little challenge there for the government minister in the room, perhaps, although I know you're on side with this COPA. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, it might not surprise you to learn that I'm not the one you need to convince. But I mean, it is good, that it is a live conversation. And one of the things that's interesting to me is a lot of people looking back at what happened after the GFC and saying, you know what, we didn't handle that so well. So that is kind of useful. Gary, what are your thoughts?
Well, thanks, James. Sorry, I'm suffering from a bit of nerves here. I'm not used to public speaking, used to lecturing and teaching quite a lot. But I should have, one of the things that I forgot to mention previously was that this has also opened up the opportunity to advance some of the thinking that we have in this range of public realm interventions, kind of called tactical urbanism and placemaking. So I'm intimately familiar with Julian Genta's work for reorganising our public realm for physical distancing. I spent many late nights preparing all the material for NZTA for that to get released last Thursday, and that's keyed directly into some of the innovating streets projects that we've been working on. But the idea of tactical urbanism is that you kind of use very small and short time frame interventions to start thinking about how we reorganise our spaces. And a lot of that, because you know that in a city, probably about 80% of about 20% of a city is public space, about 80% of that is roads, and about 90% of that is dedicated exclusively to vehicles. And so what we need to do is we can't shift every street, we can't move every curb to make them all pedestrian friendly and look like downtown Auckland. We need cheaper, quicker, lighter methodologies for trying to organise our spaces so that they are more accessible and equitable to a full range of users outside of the private motor vehicle user. And so there's already kind of a little bit of momentum being built in this space, and some of the kind of emergency response work that's been required for the physical distancing in public spaces is starting to move that even further along. So we've around the country, people are having to sharpen their pencil to figure out, like, if we're gonna shift this street to make it more accessible to a wider range of people with a range of disabilities and from all ages of society, what can we do cheaply? What can we do quickly? How can we do it effectively? So there's a real, quite a lot of momentum building in this space, and it's really exciting to see that happening kind of throughout the country, really. A little bit by need and a little bit by interest.
Great. Thank you, Gary. So what we'll do now is we're going to, Marama and I will start feeding through questions that we've been collecting from the chat. And so the first question here is from Georgia. It does say that it's to all panelists, but in the interests of time, I'm just going to ask Mary to respond to this one. Mary, a very big concern for Georgia regarding climate change is that it will disproportionately affect tangata whenua across the world who not only live off the land, but are also spiritually connected to the land. How can we address this in climate change legislation without alienating conservative New Zealand?
I think I have to be honest in saying I don't really know how to pander to conservative New Zealand very well, if I'm to be quite honest. But in terms of the question, I think for me, it's really important to look at our decision-making processes and really evaluate how transparent and inclusive they are. And I think a lot of the time we talk about transparent, inclusive decision-making processes, but no one really knows what that means or what young people are talking about. And for me, it's recognizing at what point in the process do you include the voices of those who are disproportionately impacted by this, i.e. Māori and Pacific. And my personal experience in the climate space is that Pacific are often included at the end part of the process, at the engagement, at the public portion, but not in the design of the process and the structure and the policy. And, you know, I'm not a policy nerd, but I recognize the importance of it and why we need to be in that space. And so I really implore our leaders to create that space for young Indigenous communities like Māori and Pacific, and also that Pacific and Māori young people hold their own and know that that's a space that they can occupy, and that we should be infiltrating these spaces and these processes that aren't designed for us, but it's not going to change if we're not there. And I guess one more thing that I would say is that a lot of climate organizations need to recognize that the inclusion of Māori, for me, and you know, I'm happy to be checked as well, but I think it's really important that we include Māori perspectives as tangata whenua beyond statutory obligation, so that we include them because they have inherently valuable knowledge that we could learn from as the first stewards of this land. And I think that's really important, that young people push that narrative and understand that they have a place in these processes. It's really complex. I find it complex, but there are people and leaders like yourselves who are creating these spaces for us.
Kia ora, Mary. No better said, actually. And I really wanted to tautoko your point about the value of diverse schools of knowledge. And if we think of the life cycle in nature, there is not one species that doesn't depend on the rest of the species and the habitats and the life forms around it. And I think what we're seeing is all of our diverse schools of knowledge and our experiences can only strengthen our pathway towards solutions. And that absolutely includes Indigenous knowledge and the hundreds and thousands of years of living within environments where we can add value to the knowledge bank as we try and work out together what some of the best solutions are. So I really pick up on what you're saying there, ngā mihi. I've got a question too from Patricia. Just before that, I again wanted to take a quick break and really thank our panelists for coming to share these incredible insights with us all. But I also wanted to acknowledge our grassroots climate activists, you who are advocates and experts and grassroots campaigners out there, the thousands of you across our country. We know that the only way that we are going to find these solutions and pathways is by doing it together, is by bringing people together. And nothing that we have achieved to date has not been done without the many, many of you who have been so key in helping us do this, mahi. So I just wanted to make sure I mentioned that before I go to our next question, which is, as I said, from Patricia. And it is, I think I might put this one to Amanda. It is, how do we get farmers to switch from industrial agriculture to regenerative farming, which you just touched on already?
It's interesting. I'm not Greenpeace's agricultural campaigner, so I don't spend my days speaking to farmers, but there are other people in the organization who do. And so firstly, just to acknowledge that there are many farmers in New Zealand who already use regenerative practices, and there are many more who want to be able to do farming differently. And the challenge is that the systems have all been set up to really channel people towards a kind of high input monoculture system. If we think about the last time big investments were made by government during the Think Big era, they built the Kapuni urea factory. So facilitating the use of chemical fertilizers on New Zealand's pastures, for example. So the solutions that we see are really about giving people a leg up, providing the infrastructure for organic compost, for seed distribution, providing grant finance to help people plant agroforestry, so trees within their paddocks. Also supporting with the development of processing and manufacturing, so actually investing in plants to process and manufacture plant-based and organic foods. And these are all things that are happening in other parts of the world. In many other countries, farmers receive government support in the form of finance or extension services to help them to shift to organic or sustainable farming. So none of this is outrageous or extreme, and a lot of it is actually being, desired and called for, because it's so hard to shift away from an entrenched model. So I think there's huge opportunity, and if you look at the way the marketplace is going overseas, the demand for sustainable agricultural produce, plant-based produce, is growing much faster than for conventional farming products. So the markets are screaming out for this stuff, and it would be silly for us not to help farmers to be able to take advantage of that opportunity.
Thanks, Amanda. I was talking to Pavan Sukhdev earlier today, who's the chair of World Wildlife Fund International, and he's saying very much the same thing. I said, well, what's a message to New Zealand, as opposed to sort of a general message for the world from someone, at a bit of a distance? And he said, well, the thing is, of course, you're already good at farming. Just be better at that. And actually, there's a tremendous opportunity for us to, create more value, actually, than we have been, clean up our environmental practice, and actually feed the world healthier and more sustainably grown food. And so it's actually quite an exciting proposition. Next question is for Gary. And Gary, curious, how do we, this is from Alexa. Thanks for the question, Alexa. How do we ensure that plans for ecotourism and domestic tourism include climate-friendly options for getting around between cities, as well as within cities, such as more affordable trains or coastal shipping, safer cycle touring options, long-distance buses, that kind of thing? What are you seeing out there that we could be using to be better at tourism than we have been?
I'm not a tourism expert. I have been involved in a few pieces of work up in Kaipara, though, and one of the things we're exploring, it's not a new idea, it's been hanging around the food and agriculture business for a while, but the idea of slow tourism kind of comes to mind with that, and shifting away from, I guess, tourism that is requires large-scale industrial inputs, which is, I guess, kind of obvious, but I think moving towards smaller scale, more authentic tourism, which is much more responsive to the place, and that quite often is grounded, in the ecology and the environment of that place, and equally, if not more importantly, the culture and the people who live there, and trying to kind of tie that loop between, productive systems, natural environments, authentic offerings for visitors and things. So you could imagine that you could have, you spend time and energy regenerating the natural environment there, you invest in ecologically responsive agriculture, and you start creating food products that are unique to that place. In Kaipara Harbour, for example, it's particularly well known for flounder and kumara, and those are the sorts of things that are of that place, and they can be celebrated and kind of, daylit and brought forward as part of that particular area's specialty, which is unique and different from the East Coast, which is much more about white sandy beaches and maybe slipping lattes, particularly as you shift more towards Auckland, rather than authentic kind of West Coast beaches, which require you to get kind of off the grid a little bit more. So I suspect that tourism is going to get smaller, and they're already talking about tourism getting a lot smaller. And I think as a result of that, they'll be potentially leading the charge and teaching us how to respond more authentically to what local opportunities exist throughout New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I mean, this is one of the things that I know government ministers are pretty busy with at the moment. because of course we've gone from tourism being actually our single largest industry in terms of the export dollars that we earn from it as a country to zero. And it's a huge employer, hundreds of thousands of people around the country. And it's going to be quite a while before our borders reopen or reopen in any, kind of semblance of what we might consider normality. And therefore, we just know it's going to be different. And so, there will be, no doubt, a tourism industry in New Zealand, but it will also, no doubt, be completely different to the one that we have had up until this point. And so, whilst we're in this theme of reimagining Aotearoa, that is actually one area where right in front of us, there is actually a requirement to reimagine pretty much from first principles.
Kia ora, I have another question, and I think I'll put it back to you first, Mary. We will actually ask all of our panelists to have a go at this one. So to you first, Mary, how do we ensure the monetary cost of climate change is fairly shared across generations?
That's an interesting question. I'm probably going to defer to one of my peers so I can wrap my head around the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I ask you, Amanda?
I'm also kind of sitting mulling over this one. I'm not an expert in tax policy, not even close, don't know much about it, but I mean, I think the principle of taxing bads is probably a good place to start. So that's the idea that you don't tax the good things like people's income, you tax the bad things like pollution. I think that's probably a good place to start, and it isn't something that we do particularly systematically in New Zealand. If I'm not mistaken, New Zealand has been, now I'm trying to remember what international agency has said this, but has been sort of encouraged to pick up more environmental taxes because we're falling behind the curve a little bit on that one. So that's a good place to start, I think. And I'll hand over to Gary.
Yeah, Gary, go ahead if you've got any thoughts.
Tricky question. Just bouncing off what Amanda said is one of my favorite kind of thinking around taxes is this idea that as Amanda mentioned, as we tax some of the goods like people's income, as we could start thinking quite differently about the way that we tax our economy. If you think about the economy as being a bit of a pyramid, we've got our foundation, which is our natural capital, which is our source and our sink. And we should be thinking about every time people extract, there should be some kind of cost associated with that. Every time we put something back out, which can't be reassimilated, that should also be taxed. In the middle band, you've kind of got goods and services where people live and do things on a day-to-day basis. That's an area that we should probably leave alone. And then you've got that top pinnacle of that kind of the triangle where people make money off money, and that financial kind of sector where you can imagine that that's another area where we could be being a little bit more progressive about the way that we think about what people should pay for. And we should be not making people pay taxes for generating authentic wealth and authentic prosperity in a community. And when people have the ability to kind of siphon money off as it cycles around a community, that doesn't feel like it's contributing positively to that place. In terms of like shifting the cost of climate change, was it across generations? Was that the question there?
Yeah.
That's a really tricky question. What I would add to that is I suspect that my grandchildren are probably going to be living in quite a different world, and they'll be living in a different economy with a different monetary system. So we might think about cost in a different way there, and there'll be more value given to kind of informal economics than maybe, to household and local economics than there are to some of the more kind of international monetary policies that we have framing the way we think about it today. So I suspect that in the future is that we won't be using the same measures of cost than what we are today. And the measures of cost will be more local and more reflective of trust and relationships than they will be to kind of abstract monetary systems.
Kia ora, Gary. I certainly hope we won't be using the status quo way of defining costs and benefit, because that has got us into a hell of a lot of trouble. I thought I'd quickly check, Mary, if you wanted to add any thoughts to that at all.
Yeah, I think wrapping my head around this, I think it's also really important that we're investing in renewable jobs as well and greener jobs. And I think about a lot of our families who have to do mining jobs. And, you know, we kind of villainize the coal industry and those who mine, but the reality is a lot of my family have had to because they have to feed their families. And so therefore, I think the way in which we address that is investing in green jobs, you know, not subsidizing fossil fuel companies, and recognizing that, you know, the monetary cost of not doing anything is far greater in the long term, and it's going to impact our generations to come so much more significantly. So I think that's really important.
Beautiful, Mary. That's exactly what the question was sort of aiming at. I'm going to pass back to James as another question. Before I did that, I was pretty keen on speaking into this one. It's really important to me that we constantly remember that currently the majority of wealth is built on the exploitation of our land, our waters, our soils, and in fact our people, our lower paid workers in particular in our indigenous communities and low paid communities, and that we desperately need to redistribute that wealth, and including taxing big wealth and assets. We've for far too long focused on taxing incomes, including for those on lower incomes. And a just transition approach requires that those with the least support and resource and income are not given the biggest burden as we transition into a kinder, less emissive world. And so I think this is how we will be able to ensure that in the future generations there will be much better sharing of both wealth and risk, because currently it is our planet and the majority of the people who bear the risk, while the few end up with the fruits of the benefits without that risk. So thank you all for your thoughts. I'll pass it back to James. Kia
ora, Marama. We're rapidly approaching 8:30, which is when we said that we'd ship you all off to bed. Question here for Gary, which is to return to a theme that you were talking about earlier. This question has come in from our YouTube chat. So hello, if you're tuning in from YouTube. This question is, could making some temporary changes to urban areas like widening footpaths and building temporary cycleways help make permanent change to our cities and towns? And you were talking before about kind of small scale things that we can do fast and cheap. Do they or can they become permanent? And what other changes do they induce?
Yeah, I think the intention is that they do become permanent. I think one of the key foundations of kind of tactical urbanism is that the short-term change is got line of sight with a long-term intervention. So often we start to think about what would we like this place to be like in say 5, 10, 15 years time, and then we can backcast from there and say, if we wanted this to look like this in 10 years time, what do we need to do tomorrow? And what if we were to do it really cheaply? What if we were to do it just over a weekend? What could we test to make sure that to kind of shift it in that direction, to socialize it, to get feedback immediately and to improve it? And so you kind of learn by doing through that, but it's important to kind of keep sight of that vision as well. So it's kind of balancing, I guess, having that long-term vision, holding on to that lightly, and then moving towards that with incremental change. Because I think is that this century is going to be defined by lots of small projects. It's not really going to be defined by really think big projects. I don't think there's probably going to be more, you know, large-scale black swan events like the coronavirus. But like the 20th century's past, the 21st century is about agile responses, and having a street party is one thing. Having a street party that tests how we might reuse that street in the future in another way is another thing. And I'll just quickly add as well, as one of the things that's really important in this is around building that kind of that cultural capital and that community of practice, which empowers communities to act into their own into their own spaces, and they feel like they can actually influence their public spaces in a way that they haven't been able to previously. So rather than designers coming to them and telling them what they're going to do to them, designers should be coming to them and asking them what they would like, and then working with them through small scale incremental changes towards a longer term vision.
Kia ora, Gary. Tactical urbanism is a fabulous phrase, and I like the idea of a tactical urban street party. So maybe that's something we can do when we get back down to level 1.
They already had one at Point Chev, a friend of mine. They hosted the whole, the school was out there for a day. They held the school assembly on the street. And we're working with a range of schools through Auckland, trying to figure out how to make schools more accessible, safer, working towards different types of mode shares as well through this methodology. Yeah.
Kia ora, Gary. Thank you. Gosh, I wish I could just wrap all of this goodness up and make it happen right now. We know that good work will take time and all of us working together. I've got a last question here. While it says, while we desire a green recovery with all our hearts, it's true, what are the chances this government will implement the policies put forward by the Greens, such as fast rail and connecting cities with rail as well? Thank you for that question. I'm also going to let James have a chance at this one as well. We know that many of the things that we have been able to achieve as the Green Party in this government would only have been achieved with the Green Party continually pushing and working to get things across the line, such as James's incredible work on our zero carbon legislation, such as the incredible work led by Eugenie Sage and the biggest investment into Department of Conservation and protecting our nature this term and this government has ever seen, and so many more examples of the really good work. But we also know that that was done with only 8 MPs, and we would like to ensure that we can continue on this positive path that we have started. So I think that's a really important question, and it's also going to come from all of the support from our communities, from our people across the country who continue to demand that we do better and to hold us all to account. And that helps us get these incredible solutions and policies across the line. But over to you, James.
Well, so to Marama's point, look, the more of us Greens there are in the Parliament and in the government, the greater influence we can have over government policy. That is, that's just the mathematics of how politics work. The Marama mentioned that we have 8 members of Parliament, and I'm tremendously proud that for the first time in government with ministers and only 8 MPs in total, that we've had, I think we've managed to do some pretty amazing things. Those 8 MPs make up 15% of the government bench. The rest are made up of Labour and New Zealand First MPs. So that gives you a sense of our proportionality within the government. And so, there's an election coming up on September the 19th, and we have an opportunity to change the makeup of the government. I think that we could definitely go further and faster with, shall I just say, a more simplified governmental arrangement. And if the Greens make up a larger share of the government, for sure. There's very few months left of this government. We will certainly be working right up until the very last day to implement the kinds of policies that are being talked about tonight, and to try and make the most of next week's budget and any announcements to come in the final few months of this government. But we are starting to turn our attention to what's next, which is exactly why we're asking the question about reimagining Aotearoa.
That we may have a survey and for people to share. to fill out, and that there will be a link to that coming up in the chat. But mainly I just wanted, again, I cannot thank our panelists enough. I cannot thank everyone who came. You've had incredible comments and questions running through the chat that have, that we will be able to keep a hold of and keep referring to in our work as we have our discussions across Parliament. So thank you all very much. James, to you for some final comments.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really important conversation. And we are at a very, very unusual time in our nation's history. I think Amanda pointed out that, perhaps World War II and that sort of immediate post-war period was the last time when we faced sort of the kind of economic upheaval and reorganization of our society and our economy as we're currently facing. And I think that is only really just starting to kind of sink in, and the effects of that are only just starting to be felt. And there are very few people alive today, of course, who lived through that experience, and so actually actually have some kind of understanding of the magnitude of it. It is really important, to Mary's point, that we actually work with all of our communities here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and in our wider community in the Pacific to shape the future that we want, that it doesn't just happen to us as has happened so many times before. And as I said at the start, given what we're about to do, the kind of deployment of financial capital to get us through this crisis, we have an absolute moral and an economic duty to each other and to future generations to get it right this time. Because by my reckoning, this is our last best hope for a low carbon future. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate having all of you given up your time. We've had almost 500 people join us tonight between this chat and also watching on the YouTube channel. So thank you to all of you for being a part of it, no matter where you're from in the world or around New Zealand, or which platform you're watching us and participating in. It's great to have you with us. Haere.
Kia ora, James. Before we leave, I'm going to close us with another very common, very well-known whakatauki. And one last question that I picked up through the chat earlier on, which was about, do you think that there are thoughts that Parliament might operate differently, especially given big volume travelling that MPs do as part of our job? And I always say to James all the time, as soon as that Auckland to Wellington train is established, I'm going to be the first person to use that train. So it's going to be a combination of engaging differently. Parliament now understands the power of Zoom meetings and not having to meet face-to-face all the time. And it will also be about how we get around the country when we do need to get around the country. So a really good question. Kia ora koutou, I'm going to leave us now with, there's your survey that has just popped up. Feel free to just quickly fill that out if you would like to, while I leave us with this whakatauki. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapapau namu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. May peace be widespread, may the sea be like greenstone, a pathway for us all this day. Give love, receive love, let us show respect for each other. Kia ora rā.
Kia ora.